Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by James Copley and Phil Smith. Got plenty to be discussing on this Monday afternoon. I think one thing that none of us were necessarily expecting to be discussing at this point in the season is some potential transfer business. However, it is understood that Sunderland are closing in on an agreement with free agent striker Aaron Connolly, first reported by Roker Report this morning. It's something that we've discussed on the podcast before, isn't it, Phil? The potential for Sunderland to dip into that free agent market. We sort of suggested it might not be the most usual thing for them to do, but it would appear that there's maybe been a bit of a change in stance, and it looks like a deal that Sunderland are trying to get over the line now.
Yeah, I think we're at the stage now where this is more likely than unlikely. It's really interesting, as you say. It's highly unusual for Sunderland to do this, mainly because the reality of signing a free agent outside the transfer window is that they've not had a pre-season. And therefore, you're realistically looking at a period of at least a month where any player is potentially able to impact the team on a consistent basis. I suppose where Aaron Connolly maybe differs from his standard free agent, where he probably slightly differs is that, there is the potential for this to be more of a long-term signing for Sunderland. Clearly the age he's at, the stage he's at in his career, I think it's a little bit of a calculated risk in that it's a young player who clearly hasn't delivered on the potential he showed when he first broke through at Brighton, but he has a reasonable amount of championship experience, whose goal scoring record at Hull, which was his last club, is decent, is very decent, really. And I think we can take some encouragement and I suppose some excitement from this in that it's a deal that Sunderland didn't have to do. They've got enough players to get through to January. But it's an ambitious move, and I think that it's a sign that they believe they can really have a go this season. I think what is interesting is the implications it has, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the podcast, for the rest of the squad, because it's not a small squad. It feels like it a bit at the moment because, at the moment there's a few players who aren't fit. But actually, this is a pretty big squad already, and there's a lot of implications, I think, of this deal. So I'm very encouraged to see Sunderland trying to add more experience to the group, strengthening up front, giving Labrice another option. But yeah, for sure, it's certainly surprising because they've tended to avoid signing players outside the transfer window for a very obvious reason. So, while there are reasons for it, it's a big departure from what we're used to.
James, I mean, what do you make of all of this? Because Aaron Connolly, as Phil sort of alluded to, a player who broke through at Brighton, had a huge amount of potential. He's still only 24. He maybe hasn't lit the world alight, but he has scored goals fairly consistently. And, I think last season it was something like 8 in 28 for Hull. But when you actually break that down, it was like 8 in 13 starts, which is obviously a much more impressive return, really. So, I mean, is this a deal that you're sort of pleased to see Sunderland pursuing?
I think it makes a lot of sense when you look at what Sunderland have done before. Obviously, there were different ages when they actually signed for the club than Aaron Connolly is now. But Patrick Roberts, Jack Clark, they needed a bit of a career reboot. You look at Jan Poveda as well, who signed earlier in the summer. He's after a similar spark in his career. So I think it makes sense. Phil mentioned there the profile of the player. He's only 24, championship experienced. He scored goals in the league as well. Mayand has done extremely well, I think, since coming in. Obviously didn't score against Borough, but still put himself around, makes the right runs. But over the course of a championship season, I think you are going to need a little bit more of a proven goal scorer. I think covering competition is always really important. And I think perhaps it shows maybe that Sunderland are starting to learn a little bit. We've talked a lot over recent seasons about depth. That first season in the Championship, Sunderland were hit really hard towards the end with injuries, and arguably there were a couple of injuries away from taking it to Luton Town in that second leg. They were decimated, really. I don't think they had either first choice centre back. So yeah, I think having a more robust squad is definitely something that Sunderland have needed to do. I'm pleased that there's been action taken on that. And look at Sunderland promotion teams from seasons gone by, and they had sort of goals from everywhere, didn't they? Just thinking of that Keane season when we got promoted from the Championship, there were like 3 or 4 players that could score goals: Dwight York, Aaron Connolly, Anthony Stokes, Carlos Edwards. There's probably more I'm forgetting as well. So I think it's always good to have options, and I think it's actually shown a bit of ambition in the sense that Sunderland maybe want to go and attack the Championship a little better than they did last year. And I think it's positive, to be honest. I'm quite pleased to see it's going through. It's a little bit of a change of departure that we haven't really seen Sunderland target the free agent market, but I think where there's value there, I think Sunderland should definitely go for it.
It does feel like, you're talking about the free agent market. There's not necessarily always the greatest amount of depth in there, but it's felt for like a few weeks now that if Sunderland were going to go and pursue a player who was sort of the right profile, has played in the league before, certainly in the right position as well. We've spoken endlessly about the search for striker. Then Connolly was kind of like the standout name, I think it's fair to say. Obviously, Phil, the other thing is as you already mentioned briefly, the sort of implications that this will have for other members of Regis Labrissa's squad. I mean, Elisa Mayenda has been the starting striker and has performed really well. I think we're all in agreement there over the first sort of 6 games of the season. But obviously, Wilson Isidore came in over the summer. Ahmed Abdullahi's to come back from injury as well. Naz Rusin's out there on the periphery. I mean, what do you think it means for those players now that, if Connolly does come get over the line, if he does come in the next day or two?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised in that, like, obviously we know that certainly with Abdullahi, like, he was not being signed as a player to sort of play on day one. Sunderland knew that he had this potential groin issue. Obviously, we didn't know that for a week or so after, but it was very obvious that was just them. A little bit like Mundell in January, there was a deal there to be done that they weren't expecting, and it was on the right financial terms. So they went and did it rather than saying, this is the player we need for Labrissa's team now. So I think we know that they were trying to sign other strikers towards the end of the day that they weren't able to do. So I suppose we shouldn't be surprised in that, there clearly already were signs that they felt they could do with another player in that position. And I think, as you mentioned there, Connolly clearly of the free agents was the standout name. One of the reasons I mentioned the fitness thing, which I think is a big part of it, but when Sunderland have always sort of opted against signing free agents in the past, is they always say it's not about, they would rather put their faith in a young player, or first and foremost any player has to be able to play at the level physically and technically that they think is required to succeed. So I think that in some ways there were already some hints that the likes of Rusin in particular, maybe Labris wasn't entirely sure about. I think despite the fact that Aushish and Barr played 90 minutes and scored for the under-21s yesterday, I think this is another sign that they're not a big part of the plans at the moment. I understand, obviously, Connolly doesn't play in the same position as Aushish and Barr, but I'm talking about the fact that you've got 9 players on the bench. We have Poveda, who we expect to be back at the weekend. Someone signed him in the summer. He's going to be involved. Abdullahi to come back towards Christmas. Brown to come back into the mix as well. So Salis Abdel Samed, who's not even been on the bench yet. I think we're beginning to see that Labris has been quite ruthless, hasn't he, since he came in? That's one of the things we've spoken about. He's been really sort of clear in his decision making, and so I think this is a sign that I think a few players are going to find it really difficult to get regular minutes here. I think Rusin's the big one. I think Isidore's flexibility means that he's probably going to be quite an important player for Labris. I am surprised because I felt like with the level that Mayenda was playing at and the praise that Labris has given him, even in the games where he didn't score, I thought that they might just wait till January to reassess then. They've decided to be a bit opportunistic, but I definitely think this has, fairly significant implications for Rusin, who hasn't played much recently, and certainly Aushish and Barr, although Labris, does keep saying the doors open. I think it's very, very difficult to see a scenario now just because of the sheer competition for places where they're regularly in the matchday squad.
I suppose, obviously, looking ahead to January now, that there is a version of events where Sunderland don't feel the need to go and sign a striker because Connolly does come in, because Abdullahi comes back from injury. If they perform in the way that Sunderland would like them to perform. And it sort of then raises some interesting questions about where, if anywhere, Sunderland would look to target in the winter window.
Fullback for me, I'm sure Phil would agree with that. I think that's the one position on either side that I look at and think it's a little bit light. Obviously, you have the option of 09, who has actually played left back and right back during his Sunderland career. Say if we had Ballard and Mepham fit, or Ballard and Elisi fit. Elisi's obviously played on the left before as well. But I just think behind Sunderland's top quality centre-backs, to be fair, obviously Trey Hume and Dennis Serkin, there isn't a great deal. Jensen Seelt coming back for an injury, deputised there last season, but it's going to be a long time till he's ready to go well into the new year. So don't really expect him to play that much of a significant part. It's a similar story for Huggins as well. Obviously, you don't know how they're going to recover from these injuries, but there were 2 pretty bad ones, I think. Jefferson Bennett's playing as a left back for the under-21s. Is he going to be an option in the Championship? probably not. I don't think anybody would sort of bet on that happening. So I think that's the position for me going into January on either side, really. Although Sunderland do have some sort of internal solutions, I think, good quality backup and succession planning as well, because I actually think if human Sir can continue on the trajectory, stayed injury free as well, that they could be highly sought after. So a bit of a sort of Romain Mundle, Jack Clark succession planning wouldn't go amiss in that position. But as we know, it's quite difficult to do some of these deals in January at times because the cost can be quite inflated. But saying that, you can pick up good players. We picked up Mundle in January, which looks an astute bit of business now. So yeah, really interesting. But I think left and right back for me would be the position other than striker. But that's before Connolly comes in.
And the one name we haven't mentioned as well, Phil, Trey Ogunsuri, obviously under-21 striker who's been named in the matchday squad for the past couple of weeks. And I know obviously we've seen him play a couple of times in recent weeks, James, and have been hugely impressed with his output at a youth level. I mean, probably he will, you would assume, just sort of sit around the under-21s now, maybe a little bit less first team involvement. And maybe that's not the worst thing in the world for his development as well.
Yeah, I think so. I asked LeBreeze about him last Thursday at the press conference just because it felt timely with him being on the bench, obviously at Plymouth, and then again the other day. And I think LeBreeze made pretty clear that he rates him, but it was about giving him, there was an opportunity there to sort of give him that taste of a first team match day, of the experience of being around the first team group, rather than realistically him being on the bench to come on. So I think that, you're right. Ogunsuru hasn't actually yet played a huge amount of under-21s football. And I think that's sort of the natural next step for him, is to play sort of week in, week out at that level. I think he's a hugely talented player. As you mentioned, I think he is really, really gifted. You've mentioned the games where you saw him was impressed. I thought he changed the game against Bilbao when he came on. Sunderland had obviously started well, but Bilbao were completely on top when he came on. And just his first touch, his physicality, his energy really turned the game. I do think he is an incredibly exciting prospect that, fans should be really excited by. But I think it's fairly clear that he's been on the bench as a exposure, if you like, as an experience thing, rather than necessarily being seen at this stage as a game-changing option. So I do think what we'll see is he'll probably drop out over the next few weeks and start playing more regularly in the under-21s. But that's certainly no criticism of him. I think someone just saw an opportunity while they were in this limbo, if you like, with injuries and what have you. It was a really good time to sort of give him a little bit of an exposure to that environment, which, if you remember, is exactly what happened with Chris Rigg. He travelled with the first team squad a couple of times before he eventually made his debut at Shrewsbury in the FA Cup. So I think that's a fairly sort of natural progression, if you like.
You mentioned Chris Rigg there. Should we talk about Middlesbrough? Obviously, a huge win for Sunderland, a return to winning ways for Sunderland on Saturday lunchtime after that late disappointment against Plymouth the week prior. I mean, how important, James, was it that Sunderland regained some of the momentum that they maybe lost on the South Coast?
Hugely important, I think, against Middlesbrough at the Stadium of Light. It's a big game, potential banana skin. I think it shows a good mentality within the group, really, doesn't it, to lose at Plymouth and to bounce back so quickly. As I said, against Plymouth, I didn't feel like it was sort of panic stations. I didn't think Sunderland had been cut wide open. We had a fair amount of bad luck, I would suggest as well. I didn't look at it and think LeBrice's game plan needed sort of ripping up. I think he agreed. He sort of just got them driven and training during the week, maybe reaffirmed some of his ideas and his plans, and it paid dividends. I think what's really interesting about Sunderland is they're quite happy not to have the ball at the moment, yet they never really look troubled, to be honest. I know Middlesbrough hit the bar with that Conway header, but other than that, I'm struggling. I think I was having this discussion actually with Michael Loff after the game from the Wise Men Say podcast. And when you're live watching the game and Middlesbrough cross the halfway line, as a fan, you're sort of conditioned to think, oh God, Middlesbrough on the attack, this could spell danger, because that's just what being a football fan's like. But when you actually watch the highlights back, watch the full game back, Middlesbrough aren't really doing a lot. They're not penetrating. They're not creating loads of chances. They had, a couple of moments, but I never, watching the game back, didn't really feel that Sunderland were threatened very often. There's obviously a couple of decisions as well. I mean, it's marginal whether Hume should be on the pitch, perhaps. I've heard a lot of contrasting opinions. It's one of those that's maybe halfway between a yellow and halfway between a red. So that sort of, you get some of those given for you, get some of those given against you. But Sunderland probably should have had a penalty against Mundle as well. So although Michael Carrick, I think, was a bit miffed after the game. I genuinely thought during it sort of balanced itself out, to be honest. And I think Sunderland were well worthy of the win in the end. I thought they controlled the game without having as much of the ball as Middlesbrough, if that made sense. And that sort of seems to have come a little bit of an MO under Regis Labrie. And yeah, Chris Rigg, I mean, blimey, what a finisher, what a player. And Joe Bellingham as well, that we mentioned a lot. I think he turned 19 today, actually. And it's just silly how good those two are. And Dan Neil, the self-proclaimed old man in midfield at 23 years old, it's a hugely exciting time, in my opinion, for Sunderland fans at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, there is so much to sort of dive into in more depth there. We'll talk about the Trey Hume, non-red card decision first, Phil. It was one of those, wasn't it? I sort of hate the cliche of it, but it felt like an orange card. It was, you've seen them given and you've seen players get away with them on the day as well.
Yeah, I at the time it just felt like a yellow card watching it live, and then people had obviously seen the replay on social media suggest he'd been really fortunate. When you watched it back, did I think it was like an obvious red card? I wasn't totally convinced myself. Having said that, if he'd been given red, would you be watching it back saying it's an absolute howler? I don't think you would have done. So I don't know. It's one of those things. I think it could have been given. I think he was fortunate, and it was obviously a rash challenge that could have had, that could have cost him. And so I think he has got away with it. But I don't think it was a complete howler. I thought, generally speaking, the referee was fairly poor, considering he was a Premier League referee dropped in. I thought the officiating, generally speaking, was very inconsistent, certainly in the yellow cards, and that's for both teams, by the way, not just Sunderland. And, maybe, we always say, like, it's the biggest myth in football that these things even themselves out, because it just doesn't work like that. But, last year, Sunderland lost this game because of a fairly nonsensical red card, I would suggest, to Dan Neil. So maybe they were due a bit of luck. And, I certainly think as well, again, maybe it wasn't an absolute stone wall, but I think Mundell should have had a penalty. I thought that was a trip and a push from Aylan from behind, never any realistic chance of getting the ball. And at that point, Sunderland could have put the game to bed if that decision was given. So I don't think it was an atrocious decision personally, albeit I think that Hume did get away with one. But I thought, I think it's obvious, the opposition manager, certainly after defeat, is also always going to focus on the referee. I think that Sunderland deserved it. I thought the first half there was basically nothing in it. I think it could have gone either way. I thought both teams looked dangerous when they counted and not particularly dangerous when they had the ball for long spells. And there were lots of moments where it could have gone either way. Obviously, Lath had that little thing that went just over the bar. Conway should have scored with that header. But the second half, I thought Sunderland had complete control without the ball. I never really felt threatened. The only way you felt Middlesbrough were going to score is if a 30-yarder flew in the top corner, or if there was a deflection or something like that. And I think that's borne out of the fact that, when I was taking a closer look at my analysis on Sunday, they only had 2 shots from inside the box the entire second half, and that was them chasing the game. So I do think Sunderland deserved the win, given the fact that they led for so long and were able to limit Middlesbrough so much. And that was the most encouraging thing, because we worried after the Plymouth game that maybe Plymouth had found some ways to expose what had been a really good defence previously. So for Sunderland to get back so quickly to doing well what they'd been doing, against a very good opponent, I think is hugely encouraging. So, yeah, maybe a little bit of fortune early on, but for me, over the course of 90 minutes, I thought Sunderland just about deserved the win. And given how strong I think Middlesbrough are, I think that's a really exciting sign moving forward.
Just on Hume again as well, I don't think it should work like this, but I think it probably counted in his favour that it was early on in the game as well. I think had it been a little bit later, it shouldn't work like that, because if it's bordering on a red, then it's bordering on a red. It should be given as a red, but because it was so early, I wonder if the referee sort of made him think twice about it. Phil raises a good point about Premier League referees dropping down, though. I always find it annoying when the Premier League referees are parachuted into a big game in the Championship, because the threshold of fouls, it's just different. The games flow differently. The referee differently in the EFL, particularly from the Championship to the Premier League. It's such a big jump that I always feel like these Premier League referees that are parachuted in just struggle with the consistency of decision making, because it's different than what they used to. And I think we definitely saw that Sunderland versus Middlesbrough, and it was pretty poor for both sides.
Well, it was Jared Gillett last year, wasn't it, who took charge of this fixture at the time last year, and obviously he, like you say, Phil, gave Dan Neil that fairly contentious red card, and I don't know, it does seem to rear its head quite a lot, doesn't it? Chris Rigg, we're journalists, we try not to be too hyperbolic about these things, but how special is this boy?
I think he can be. He can be anything. I think that's obvious now at this stage. I think that we are now at the point where it's just the raw facts of how good is he? Well, how many players of his age are playing this regularly with this kind of output at this standard of football? And the answer is a tiny, tiny handful. And I think that Rigg can pretty much be anything he wants to be, because at the moment, well, not just, there are no obvious flaws in his game. Physically, he can look after himself already at this level. He doesn't seem to tire, so his athleticism is really good, and his technical quality is very, very good. He can be anything. It's going to be up to him now. It's as simple as that. And I think one of the most exciting things about Rigg is that nobody gives you any indication who actually knows him and spends time with him that they have any concerns about his ability to stay grounded, to keep his feet on the floor, to keep improving. It's one of the first things everyone mentions about him. I really like Labrisse's quote in the press conference afterwards, where he said, he doesn't think too much about the age, because you can be 30 and immature, or you can be 17 and mature. Age doesn't always equal maturity. And I think it's so true in Rigg's case. I think, I think you're absolutely right, Jason. I think it's not being hyperbolic. I think it's just a fact that this guy can play at the top level. But of course, the only sort of caution to that is we're 6 games into the season, and part of the journey that he's going to go on is learning how to deliver week in, week out over a 46-game season. We haven't yet had a league midweek fixture, so that's going to be a new challenge for him when he's got the Tuesday game as well. And I say that not as a downer, I just say it as the same with Mundle, is that I anticipate there'll be a point in the season where maybe we go, he's probably not quite where he was right at the start of the season, or maybe he's not at his best form. And I think that, it's important not to get carried away with that either when that happens. But in answer to your question, I don't think there's any element of hyperbole. I think we're talking about potential Champions League footballer in the future if he sort of can keep his feet on the ground and keep improving. I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that he's got both the technical ability and the physicality to go and play at that level. It's incredibly exciting. And I mentioned it on our On the Whistle with James after the game. I do think that maybe in 10 years' time we'll sort of laugh that we were watching, this Joe, Rigg, Neil triangle, at championship level. I think we might look back and wonder how on earth that happened, because I think the talent in the 3 of them is scary. It's going to be interesting, obviously, moving forward, just to move it on a little bit in terms of when Salis Abdul Samed's fit as well, because I think there is an argument that now that Sunderland are playing just with one holder midfielder very much rather than 2, is that role perfect for Neil, or might we get a bit more out of him, pushing him further forward when Samed's fit? I think it's really exciting that there are these combinations, when Brown comes back as well. That's a position that we felt was maybe a bit of a weakness last season that now feels like arguably Sunderland's strongest position on the pitch. And given how long the season is, I think that's really, really exciting.
I think you're absolutely right. We feel so stacked in the middle of the park, and I think part of that, James, as well, is Joe Bellingham, isn't it? I mean, I know he was your man of the match on Saturday, Phil. It's not necessarily that he wasn't playing well last season, but he seems to have come on leaps and bounds over the summer, doesn't he?
He has, and I think it's testament to him that he set such a high bar for himself anyway, that yes, he's had praise for his performances, but it's not really a surprise anymore. I think that's really testament to the levels he set at such a young age. Obviously, we've seen him as a 17-year-old, all the way through to his 18th and 19th birthday, and it's almost just, it's not a shock anymore that Joe Bellingham's good at football. And I think what's really pleased me, we saw quality. Obviously, he netted goals last season, important goals too against Rotherham. Springs to mind, he got that one against Plymouth, which was quality. He's shown technical ability. For me, it's the mentality. It was the desire in the middle, playing as that number 8 role against Middlesbrough. He was getting stuck into anything. He was using his body really, really well. He was across everything. He was sort of doing those doggies, that defensive work. And that for me is really pleasing, especially when you consider Rigg into that as well. Rigg does that, Dan Neil does that. They all, and you could throw Romain Mundle in there as well, actually. They all understand the defensive side of the game at such a young age, which is hugely, hugely important. And I think actually when you talk about these young players, that's what will actually set them apart, is that they are really technically talented and able, but they also understand their role on a football field as well, and that they can't be passengers, and that they do come back and they do work for the team. And just on the Chris Rigg point earlier, I'm not sure I've seen a better 17-year-old play for Sunderland. If you look at sort of the headline names through Sunderland's academy over the years, like Jordan Henderson, probably at a similar level to Chris Rigg when he was 17, although he didn't break through for Sunderland until a little bit later, but that's because Sunderland were in the Premier League. I think he's the only really sort of comparable player. Obviously, Jordan Pickford in a different position, didn't see him a little bit until later. Mickey Gray is obviously a player who came on through Sunderland's academy and had a tremendous career. We've had a lot of good footballers come through Sunderland's academy and had really, really good careers, but I'm not sure that anybody's ever come through at Sunderland at 17 and been this good. I think he's ridiculous at the moment.
And another man who made his debut at the weekend, obviously quite a bit more experienced than Chris Rigg, but nonetheless very, very effective. Chris Metham. I mean, coming into that side because Dan Ballard didn't train the whole week, Phil, but it looked like he'd been there for weeks, months, years even.
It was exactly what you hope from like an experienced Premier League central defender that you bring in on loan. I thought he was really, really, really good. It's almost like the biggest compliment you can pay centre half, isn't it? That most of the time you don't really notice they're there. Just made simple but effective decisions in possession. Always seemed to be in the right place to sort of snuff out crosses or shepherd the ball when there was a ball over the top. I thought it was a seriously impressive debut. I think it was one of the most complete debuts I've seen for quite a while, to be honest. I was so encouraged by his performance, and I think again, it gives me encouragement that Sunderland were prepared to do that deal, similar with Alan Brown, maybe something a little bit different to what we've seen from him in the past. I think it's really exciting, and I think realistically, it's huge. I think that Ballard, I think, is a future Premier League player. I think he's been amazing for Sunderland since he signed, and I think that now, he now knows that he might not play on Saturday, and that when he next comes back in the team, he has to be 8, 9 out of 10. Otherwise, he might lose his place again. So, I think that it's a really exciting signing in its own way, and I thought it was an excellent debut. And I just feel like, again, we talked about the centre and midfield there. I know that with Elise injured, Sunderland don't have loads of depth at centre half, but they do have when people are fit, and hopefully Elise will be back in November. For me, 4 top end Championship central defensive options competing for 2, possibly 3 places. I just think it's a really, really healthy place to be. And I think you're always looking at this stage of the season to see whether what you're doing is sustainable. And I think that naturally there will be a dip for Sunderland at some stage. There's going to be a point where teams work them out a little bit and they have to find some nuances. There might be a point where some young players dip. I think we have to be prepared for that and not get sort of overreact when that happens. But I think the depth in the squad generally is much, much better than it has been in recent times. And I think that gives me excitement when these midweek games start. Sunderland might be in a better position. I know that sounds a bit odd at the moment when you've got academy players on the bench, but when you actually think about where the squad could be in 3-4 weeks' time, I think it is quite exciting. And that's ultimately when Sunderland are going to need those players, when those midweek games, when you've got Derby on a Tuesday night, which we saw last year. Remember when we lost to Huddersfield, just before Mowbray went, we lost to Rotherham in midweek, lost away to Huddersfield in midweek. That is really when you have to show some steel and show some depth. And I feel like we're getting slowly to a point, albeit there's a couple of positions where it's not the case, fullback being one, where one injury or one player dipping their form doesn't feel like it's going to be the end of the world for Sunderland. And that's what we've all been sort of hoping for a while now.
I'll throw this question to both of you, but I asked it on social media earlier. When the 4 centre-backs are fit, Ballard, Alessi, O'Nien and Metham, we've obviously seen a fair bit of Alessi now at centre-back. Metham we've only seen one game, but what is Sunderland's strongest centre-back pairing? I think it's hard to come up with a definitive answer.
I honestly couldn't. I couldn't answer that question. I genuinely couldn't, and I think that's a really good position to be in. I think that at the start of the year, I wouldn't have put Elise in that category because we hadn't seen much of him at centre half. I thought by the time he got injured, he was playing really, really well. And after a couple of games to find his feet, I thought he looked like he was showing a lot of promise. I think that it's always tempting this thing with O'Nien where we almost sort of go, oh, well, he's not really a centre half, and I think the reality is that he always improves. And to be honest, it wouldn't be a huge surprise to see him improve again now that there's competition. I just think it's really hard to pick a Sunderland team without Luke O'Nien in it. It's not something I would be doing. So for me, O'Nien's, I still think he's one of the first names on the team sheet. But I think the nice thing is, there's variety there as well. Very different kinds of centre halves. Ballard brings a level of physicality and aerial dominance that I don't think anybody else does. And there's certain games where that's going to be absolutely crucial. And I think that's a nice thing. And I think Lebris has been hinting really from day one that, generally speaking, he's going to be a lot like Alex Neil. He's not one of those who don't change a winning team, or he will look at every single game on its own merits and pick the players that he thinks are best for the game. We haven't really seen that from him so far, because I don't think he's had the options because of injury and fitness and what have you. He's pretty much had to stick with a settled 11. But I do think he's going to, as the season goes on, he's going to tinker. And, it might be the case that someone plays really well and drops out the next game. I do think that's going to be sort of a theme. I think we'll see a lot more rotation from him moving forward.
Yeah, I would fully echo that. I mean, out of that thought, to be fair, whoever was to be left out, you'd feel a little bit indignant for them, wouldn't you? Because all four of them, I know Ballard obviously, had a couple of difficult moments against Plymouth, but all four of them have shown their merits already this season. And I think, again, it's another cliche, and I'm not huge on cliches, but it's a nice headache for Regis Lebris to have, knowing that he has those four players when they're all fully fit. Obviously, like you say, at least it's going to be a little while longer now, but when they're all fully fit and he is picking two out of the four, it's a far cry from the days of Sunderland just desperately trying to cobble together a back four, isn't it? You mentioned that Luton second leg, James, and there wasn't a single player over 6 foot on the pitch, was there? So
no, there wasn't. And it's mad as well, because like coming into the season, had you have said that some Sunderland fans would have Ballard as potentially third choice behind two other centre backs, you'd have thought, how in the world does that happen? But at the moment, in the minds of Sun fans, not saying it's right or wrong, and obviously you need rest of rotation, but at the moment, Ballard's third choice.
Well, I guess that is the question, isn't it? Because like looking in the sort of immediate short term at the Watford game, like would you stick with Metham and 09? Would you leave Ballard on the bench for that game, or would you reintroduce him?
I think from what I saw at the weekend, I would be loath to change it. I thought Metham and 09 did really well together. I think actually playing next to Metham could help take Luke 09 on again, as Phil mentioned. I think what we forget about Ballard as well is that his pre-season was really sort of heavily interrupted, wasn't it, by that injury? He got himself fit, and then he's had that Plymouth issue as well. So I actually don't think it's the worst thing in the world that Ballard maybe is out for a little bit and comes on toward the end of games or whatever. And we know about Sunderland in the Championship and just Championship teams in general. You do need a squad, so I don't think I'd break that partnership up just yet. But I mean, yeah, it is a great headache to have. It really is.
Just moving away from the first team a little bit, Phil. Obviously, I know we spoke about Adil Ashish and Abdullah Bar before on the pod. Both of them played for the under-21s on Sunday, 4-3 defeat against Everton away from home. Both of them scored for the under-21s against Everton as well. I mean, is that something, do you think Regis Lebris will have an eye on? Will he be encouraged by the work that they're showing to maybe try and force his way back into his plans?
Yeah, a little bit. I think it's quite a hard one to work out, isn't it? I think that, I asked him about the two of them last week at his press conference, and he sort of said that he'd been pleased with what they'd done in training. And then Saturday seemed like an obvious chance to bring Ashish back into the squad, didn't it? With Alan Brown not being available. I know they're not the same player, but, realistically, they occupy similar positions on the pitch. And I just felt that was quite telling, because I think that ultimately, if Sunderland had been 1-0 down after 70 minutes or whatever, Ashish is a player who could potentially make something happen for you. And I think it's probably quite revealing that Lebris opted not to bring him into the squad. He's been very clear that he's not closed the door on them and they can still force their way back in training, but it feels like they've got a long way to come back. And I just think, like the sign of Connolly, as I said before, I understand that they don't play in the same position, but realistically, that's another attacking player who is coming in the building to play. And I think when you put Poveda in the mix, Brown back from injury, they need to find a place in the squad for Samed. I just think it's going to be really difficult. I can't see either of them really regularly getting their way back in. And the reality is, certainly Ashish, who's played most of his football in League One, the French League One, that is obviously. I think we're at a stage where I think those two are going to be looking to move in January, and I suspect it'll be the same with Roussin if, as it plays out, Connolly comes in and takes that place in the squad. So I think credit to both of them really for obviously taking that chance yesterday, playing 90 minutes, scoring. It feels like they've got quite a bit of work to do. I don't feel like Lebris is going to change his mind kind of overnight. He doesn't seem to give us that impression. So you never know. Football's a strange game, but I just feel like maybe sort of the writing's on the wall a little bit for those two. But you never know, if they keep sort of impressing and training, they keep scoring in under 21s games, then they've got a chance, haven't they?
Yeah, that's the thing as well. It does feel like Labris is willing to be genuinely quite meritocratic about things as well. And obviously the one name we haven't even mentioned yet, James, is Milan Alexic. He's sort of been kind of involved for the first time over the weekend and on the bench on Saturday, and then obviously played for the under-21s on Sunday. And again, he's another player who it's going to take a little bit of time for him to get up to speed, but he's another option in the middle of the park, isn't he?
Yeah, I think it'll definitely be a slow burner. When I went to the Q&A with the summer signings at the stadium of like last week, he didn't speak any English at all, really. So I think that'll be something they'll be looking to rectify. He's such a young lad coming into a new country. It's going to take a while. We've seen it with other players, haven't we? Obviously, Mayenda, it's taken him a year to sort of find his feet. So I think anything we get from Alexic this season will be a bit of a bonus, really. I think I'm excited to see him play because he's so highly rated. But yeah, it's one of those where we don't really know what sort of impact he's going to have on Sunderland's first team. It could be one for the future. I might be doing him a disservice, and he might come in and really surprise us and start contributing fairly soon. But I guess that's why it's so exciting, isn't it? It's the sort of the unknown. It's one of those nice sort of foreign football manager signs, isn't it? When you get somebody that's highly rated and you're excited to see how they'll do. But yeah, looking forward to seeing him play, definitely.
And finally, Phil, Watford next weekend, another tricky test for Labris's side.
Yeah, it's that interesting stage of the season, isn't it, where it's really difficult to work out how strong an opponent is. So, like, is this the Watford who won their first 3 games of the season, or the one who lost 4-1 to Norwich, who haven't exactly had a brilliant start of the season themselves? So, yeah, it's going to be a really interesting game. They're still a team who I think have a lot of quality. I think that realistically, they're not a million miles away from being the team that had parachute payments and had Premier League players in it. So I think it's one that you cannot afford to take lightly because they have real individual quality. Interesting that their centre half and also their goalkeeper and captain both came off with injuries within 15 minutes of the game starting on Saturday. So, if neither of them are fit for this weekend, then that's a pretty big blow for them. So, yeah, I think it'll be a really difficult game. I think what's really nice about Sunderland at the moment is, it doesn't feel like, especially when they go away from home because of the points they've already put on the board, like they're under a huge amount of pressure, really. I think we've seen this season that they seem to really enjoy it when they can invite the other team on a little bit and maybe try and break at pace. So looking forward to it. I think it's just a nice feeling to, we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about, which player has to drop out, who's going to be really unlucky not to be picked. Feels like a while since we've been kind of having those conversations. So yeah, looking forward to it. But I do think it'll be a tricky game, although I don't expect Watford to be up there this year. I think they have declined quite a bit from the team a few years ago that was sort of jumping between the Championship and the Premier League. They still have enough. They definitely have enough individual quality, and we've seen that in the last few times Sunderland have played them in various fixtures, even when they haven't been doing very well. They've got individuals who can hurt you. So another really tricky game, but no reason for Sunderland to be anything other than really positive and optimistic going into it either.
Okay, lovely stuff. I think that's probably all we've got time for on this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all of the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, follow the latest Black Cats news at sunderlandecho.com, or if you're not already, follow the 3 of us on social media. Thanks to James, thanks to Phil, thanks to you for listening. Catch you again next week. Goodbye.